Intrigue/mystery hook. Forget what you thought you knew about World War II tank battles. We're diving deep into an untold story of personal rivalry and tactical brilliance, where two legendary tank commanders, one American, one German, faced off in a duel that defined an era. Discover the high-stakes decisions and intense psychological warfare that truly shaped the outcome of their epic encounter. In the dying winter of 1944, as Europe trembled beneath the thunder of armor, two men, separated by language, loyalty, and destiny, were on a collision course. One, an American tanker from Kansas, battle-hardened and unbroken. The other, a German Panzer Ace whose reputation had already become legend. Their confrontation would become more than just a duel of steel. It was a test of will, intellect, and faith in the machines they commanded. Forget what you thought you knew about tank warfare. This isn't a story of numbers or victory parades. It's the story of two men who looked across a smoking battlefield and knew only one would drive away alive. The winter of 1944 hung over Europe like a frozen shroud. Snow fell in heavy, soundless sheets, coating the shattered forests and broken towns of the Ardennes in ghostly white. Beneath that icy silence, tanks growled like trapped beasts, their engines straining against the cold, their crews fighting not only the enemy, but the creeping exhaustion that came from too many battles and too little hope. Amid this desolation, two men, on opposite sides of the same war, were unknowingly being drawn toward one another, toward a fateful encounter that would test everything they had ever learned about courage, instinct, and survival. Captain Jack Miller of the U.S. Army's 37th Armored Battalion had never wanted to be a hero. He was a Kansas farm boy, raised on the hum of machinery and the smell of diesel. To him, the tank was just another engine to be understood, maintained, and respected. But the war had a way of turning simple men into legends, and by late 1944, Miller was already known among his men as the kind of commander who never panicked under fire. He had a calmness about him, a quiet, steel-eyed determination that steadied everyone in the crew compartment when shells began to fall. Yet, even he couldn't shake the growing dread that came with every whisper of a German Tiger tank in the area. He had seen what those monsters could do. The thick armor, the devastating 88mm gun, the way a single well-placed shot could turn a Sherman tank into a burning coffin within seconds. Still, Miller's job was to move forward, to hold the line, and to bring his men home. Fear, in the armored corps, was a luxury none could afford. Across the battlefield, hidden somewhere beyond the tree line, Oberst Karl Reinhardt watched the same winter unfold through the periscope of his Tiger tank. To his men, he was a commander of precision and discipline, one of the last true Panzer Aces left in a collapsing German army. Once a proud cavalry officer, Reinhardt had spent the first half of the war carving his name into legend across the Eastern Front. But those years had changed him. The endless killing, the waste, the shifting tides of ideology, all had stripped away the glory he'd once believed in. Now, his war was personal. He fought not for victory or furor, but for perfection, for mastery of his craft, for the sheer art of outthinking his opponent in the heat of battle. The Tiger beneath him was his last trusted ally, a mechanical giant that responded to his commands like a living extension of his own will. That morning, as snow blanketed the forest in silence, both men prepared for what neither knew would be the most defining battle of their lives. Miller's Sherman rolled carefully along a narrow road, its tracks cutting black scars into the untouched white. The crew inside was silent. Corporal Davis at the gun, Sergeant Cole loading shells, Private Ramirez guiding the tank through the maze of trees. The radio crackled faintly, bringing fragments of panic and orders from other units scattered through the forest. Somewhere ahead, they were told, German tanks had been spotted. "Keep your eyes open," Miller murmured, scanning the mist ahead through his periscope. "If they're Tigers, we'll hear them before we see them." His voice was calm, but every man in that steel coffin felt the weight of what those words meant. Meanwhile, miles away, Reinhardt's Tiger moved like a stalking predator through the same woods. Fuel was low. Ammunition, precious. His crew said little. They were veterans too, and they knew the art of silence. The Tiger's engine rumbled like distant thunder as they crept through the fog, snow crunching beneath the heavy treads. Reinhardt studied the terrain, every fallen branch and frozen slope, calculating the possibilities. He had spent years teaching his men to anticipate, not to react. "Patience," he whispered in German, his voice barely audible. "We will let them come to us." Then fate intervened. Through the falling snow, Miller caught a glimpse of something, dark, angular, too large to be anything but a tank. "Contact," his gunner shouted. 11 o'clock, 400 yards. In that instant, everything inside the Sherman erupted into motion. "Traverse left. Load armor piercing." Miller barked, his voice sharp and controlled. The gun swung toward the shadow just as Reinhardt's gunner spotted movement through his own scope. "Sherman, 2 o'clock, Reinhardt said coolly. "Fire when ready." Both tanks turned their turrets almost in unison, massive steel beasts aligning like duelists about to draw. The Sherman fired first. The shell screamed across the clearing, slammed into the Tiger's thick frontal armor, and bounced away harmlessly into the snow. Inside the Tiger, Reinhardt didn't flinch. "Return fire," he ordered, and the Tiger's 88mm cannon roared. The explosion tore through the forest, splintering trees, sending shockwaves of snow cascading from the branches. The shell missed by inches, gouging a crater beside Miller's tank and showering it with earth and ice. The next few minutes became a deadly chess match. Miller ordered his driver to weave, zigzag through the trees, never stay still long enough to be targeted. The Tiger adjusted, slow but deliberate, each movement calculated, every turn of the turret guided by experience. The two tanks danced through the snow, each one firing, missing by fractions, circling like predators waiting for the perfect strike. To the outside world, it was chaos, fire and smoke and the thunder of cannons. But to the two men inside those machines, it was pure focus, pure strategy. Every gear shift, every second of delay, every flash of movement meant the difference between life and death. Inside his Sherman, Miller's world had narrowed to the sound of his breathing and the pounding of his heart. "He's ranging us," Cole shouted over the roar of the engine. "He's got us zeroed in." Miller didn't answer. He was thinking, counting the rhythm of the Tiger's shots, measuring the distance between them, watching the angles. He knew the Tiger was slow to turn. Its weight was both its strength and its weakness. If he could just get behind it, aim for the engine compartment, they'd have a chance. Reinhardt, meanwhile, was watching too. The American was good, disciplined, unflinching. Not like the reckless tankers he'd faced before. This one was deliberate, cautious, and that intrigued him. "An American with patience," Reinhardt murmured. "Interesting." Then the forest went quiet again. The snow fell heavier, blurring vision to almost nothing. Both commanders held their breath, waiting for a sound. An engine rev, a branch crack, anything that would give away the other's position. Somewhere in that white hell, two of the finest tankers of the war faced each other across less than 100 yards of frozen wilderness, their machines steaming in the cold, their hands poised over triggers. For now, the battle had paused. But both men knew it wasn't over. It was only beginning. And before the sun set, only one tank would be left standing in that silent forest. Long before their tanks ever faced each other through drifting snow, the paths of Jack Miller and Carl Reinhardt had begun worlds apart. One in the open farmlands of Kansas, the other amid the broken ruins of post-World War I Germany. Yet both men were molded by the same relentless teacher, war itself. Jack Miller grew up under a sky so wide it seemed endless. Kansas was a place where the wind never stopped blowing, where the land stretched for miles in every direction, where a boy learned early that life rewarded those who could endure. His father owned a small farm, wheat, cattle, a battered Ford pickup that refused to die. Jack's earliest memories were of turning wrenches, fixing engines, learning the language of machines. He found peace in precision, in the rhythmic hum of an engine brought back to life by his hands. When the Great Depression hit, the family fought to survive, selling crops at a loss, repairing neighbors' tractors for food instead of cash. Jack learned to keep calm when everything around him seemed to fall apart. That calm would one day save lives. In 1940, when the world began to burn again, he enlisted not out of patriotism, but practicality. "It's better than starving," he told his mother. But the army saw something in him, a steadiness, an instinct, and placed him in armor. By the time he arrived in Europe after D-Day, He'd become a tank commander in the 37th Armored Battalion, 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army. He wasn't loud like other officers. He didn't shout. But when the shells started falling, he was the one who made decisions that saved his crew. His men would later say, when Miller spoke, you listened, because he was never wrong. Half a world away, Karl Reinhardt had been raised in the shadow of defeat. Born in 1912, he was a boy when the Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of pride and power. His father, once an officer in the Kaiser's army, never stopped mourning the lost empire. Every evening, he would sit in his chair, uniform still folded in the closet, and talk of honor, discipline, and betrayal. Karl absorbed those lessons deeply. He grew into a tall, serious young man, intelligent, methodical, reserved, who believed that order and skill could restore what chaos had destroyed. When Hitler rose to power, Reinhardt watched with cautious fascination. He saw in the new Reich both danger and opportunity. While others shouted slogans, Karl studied tactics. He joined the Panzerwaffe not for ideology, but for the machine. The tank, sleek, powerful, unstoppable, represented everything he valued: precision, control, mastery of the battlefield. By 1941, he was commanding a Panzer III on the Russian front. There, he learned the art of war the hard way, in endless mud, fire, and blood. He fought through the frozen hell of Stalingrad, survived ambushes that claimed entire companies, and watched men die by the hundreds for a few yards of ground. Through it all, he learned to see war not as glory, but as a game of endurance. Victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the one who could keep his mind clear when all others broke. By 1943, Reinhardt had earned a Knight's Cross in command of a Tiger I tank. He studied every aspect of his machine like a surgeon studying anatomy: the range of the 88mm gun, the weak points in enemy armor, the physics of ricochet and penetration. He taught his men that a tank was not a weapon, but a living creature that responded to discipline and understanding. When the Allies landed in Normandy, Reinhardt was transferred west. His experience made him valuable, but deep down, he knew the war was lost. Germany's industry was collapsing, the Luftwaffe crippled, the supply line strangled. Still, he fought on, not for Hitler, not for victory, but for the perfection of the duel. Every engagement became a test of skill, a dance of intellect. In December 1944, fate placed him in the Ardennes with what remained of his battalion. His Tiger crew, veterans like himself, knew the odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on fumes. But Reinhardt's confidence was unbroken. "We fight as we have always fought," he told them, lighting a cigarette as the snow fell thick around their tank. Quietly, precisely, without fear. Meanwhile, Jack Miller's Sherman column was pushing east. The men were exhausted, frostbitten, half-starved, and sleepless from constant alerts. The Battle of the Bulge was in full swing. German armor had punched deep into Allied lines, and confusion reigned. Orders changed hourly. Maps became lies. The front shifted like smoke. Miller's mission was simple on paper: locate and hold a key crossroads near the village of Lutzkampen. In reality, it was chaos. Convoys burned along the roadside. Civilians fled through the snow. Overhead, gray skies grounded the air corps that could have saved them. It was during that push, amid radio silence and frozen trees, that Miller first heard the whispers. "There's a Tiger out there," a lieutenant said, his voice low over the static. "Picked off 3 Shermans yesterday. Kills with 1 shot. Commander's supposed to be some ace from the Eastern Front." Miller had nodded, expression unreadable. He'd seen what a single Tiger could do to a platoon. But fear was useless. You just stayed sharp, watched the terrain, and hoped your crew trusted you as much as you trusted them. Both men were moving toward the same patch of forest, guided by orders written by men who would never see the battlefield themselves. And in that convergence, one man seeking mastery, the other simply trying to survive, history would stage its quiet duel. In the barracks the night before contact, Miller sat by the dim glow of a lantern, writing in a battered notebook. He wasn't sure why he still did it. Habit, maybe. A letter to no one in particular. He wrote about the cold, about his crew, about the way snow made everything feel unreal. Then he wrote one line that stayed on the page, pressed hard in pencil. "If I don't make it, tell them I tried to keep my men alive." Across the frozen distance, Reinhardt cleaned the breech of his Tiger's cannon with meticulous care. His gunner, a young man barely 20, watched in silence. "You've done this 100 times, Herr Oberst," the gunner said. Reinhardt smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I will do it 101. He looked up at the snow drifting past the hatch and added softly, "There will always be another duel." And so, as dawn approached on that bitter December morning, two tank commanders, one American, one German, prepared to meet. Neither knew the other's name. Neither knew this encounter would define them. But both understood the same truth that every soldier eventually learns. War reduces the world to one moment, one shot, one heartbeat between life and death. And that moment was coming. The dawn came late in the Ardennes. The sky, a dull gray blanket, hung low over the forest, swallowing sound and light alike. The snow fell so thickly that it blurred the horizon, turning the world into a white void broken only by the black silhouettes of shattered trees and burnt-out vehicles. Somewhere beneath that silence, two predators moved toward each other, unaware, unseen, but inevitable. Jack Miller's Sherman tank rumbled slowly down a narrow road half buried in snowdrifts. Its engine coughed and groaned, struggling against the cold. Inside, the air reeked of oil, sweat, and cordite, a claustrophobic steel womb where 5 men breathed in rhythm with their machine. The driver, Corporal Eddie "Shorty" Jones, hunched low behind the controls, eyes barely visible beneath his frost-lined helmet. Beside him, the bow gunner tapped nervously at a photograph taped above the periscope. A girl smiling in summer sunlight, impossibly far from this frozen nightmare. "Visibility's crap," Eddie muttered, his breath fogging the glass. "Feels like we're driving into the end of the world." Miller, standing in the turret with his head just below the hatch, didn't respond. He was watching the tree line through his binoculars, searching for the faintest sign, a flicker of movement, a glint of metal. His crew trusted that silence. When their commander went quiet, it meant he was thinking, calculating. The only sound inside the Sherman was the steady hum of the engine and the distant echo of artillery somewhere far behind them. Radio's dead again. The loader, Private Harris, called from the back. "Can't raise command." "Then we move like ghosts," Miller said finally. "No noise, no silhouette on the ridge. Stay in the low ground." They moved forward slowly, treads grinding against the ice. The forest swallowed them. Snow-laden branches brushed against the sides of the tank like skeletal hands. Each man listened, not to voices, not to orders, but to instinct. It was the sixth sense of soldiers who had lived too long under fire, the deep animal awareness that something unseen was watching them. And indeed, something was. Less than 2 kilometers away, hidden beneath a camouflaged net in a small clearing, Karl Reinhardt's Tiger Eye waited. Its crew had been motionless for hours, every sound muffled beneath layers of snow. Inside, condensation dripped from the ceiling, freezing before it reached the floor. The gunner, Feldwebel Otto Bremer, peered through his gun sight, scanning the fogged distance. "Herr Oberst," he whispered, "I think I hear engines." Reinhardt raised his gloved hand for silence. He listened. Faintly, like a heartbeat through the snow, came the low growl of an approaching engine, lighter, less powerful than a Tiger's Maybach. "Sherman," he murmured. "Perhaps 2. Maybe 3. He looked at his map, though he hardly needed it. The terrain lived in his mind. The slope of the hill, the curve of the road, the hollow where ambush would be perfect. "We wait," he said calmly. "Let them come closer. We strike when they commit." The Tiger was a beast of steel and geometry, 57 tons of armored dominance, armed with the feared 88mm KWK 36 cannon. Its armor could shrug off the Sherman's shells like pebbles, while its own gun could kill at over 2 kilometers. Yet it was slow, heavy, and clumsy in tight terrain. The forest could be its tomb if maneuver went wrong. Reinhardt knew this. He would not waste a shot. He never did. Minutes passed, slow and suffocating. Then, through the periscope, movement, the faint shadow of a Sherman edging along the tree line, cautious, unaware. Reinhardt's heart slowed. He felt the old clarity, that cold, perfect stillness that came just before battle. "Target sighted," Otto whispered. "Range, 800 meters," Reinhardt replied softly. "Angle, 20 degrees. Wait for full broadside." The Sherman rolled forward another 20 meters, its flank exposed. Miller's tank turned slightly to check a junction, unaware that in that exact moment, the crosshairs of a German Tiger were resting perfectly on its armor. "Fewer," Reinhardt said. The 88mm gun roared like a god's thunder. The Tiger shook with recoil. The shell tore through the cold air and struck the Sherman's flank with a blast that shattered the stillness of the forest. Inside Miller's tank, the world became noise and fire. The impact threw everyone against the walls. The radio operator screamed. The interior filled with black smoke. "Hit!" Eddie shouted, fighting to steady the tank. "Left side." It didn't penetrate. Miller coughed, waving the smoke away. He saw the dent on the armor. Deep, but not fatal. The Tiger's shell had struck at an angle, deflecting just enough to save them. Luck, pure and impossible. "Back us up," he ordered. "Find cover. Harris, load AP." The Tiger reloaded. "They're reversing," Otto said. "Good," Reinhardt answered. "They'll panic. Second shot will finish it." But Miller wasn't panicking. He'd already spotted the muzzle flash from the Tiger's first shot. "There," he shouted, pointing to a cluster of pines on the ridge. "That's our hunter." Eddie swung the Sherman sideways as Harris rammed an armor-piercing round into the breach. The gunner, Sergeant Lewis, sighted through the periscope, searching the smoke for the faint silhouette. "Got something movement, maybe." "Send it." Miller barked. The Sherman's 75mm cannon cracked. The shot missed, slamming into a tree beside the Tiger, showering the German crew with splinters. Otto cursed. Reinhardt didn't move. "He's quicker than I thought," he said coldly. "Just 2 degrees right." Fewer. Another explosion. The second shell smashed into the Sherman's turret, shearing off the commander's hatch. Miller ducked just in time, the blast wave knocking him flat. Metal fragments tore into the loader's arm. "I'm hit." Harris gasped, clutching his bleeding sleeve. Miller's voice stayed calm. "Bandage it." "Lewis, fire smoke. We're moving." Eddie floored the throttle. The Sherman lurched backward, laying down a thick white cloud as it vanished into the trees. The Tiger's gun fired again, the shell slicing through the smoke but hitting nothing. For a moment, silence returned. Reinhardt lowered his binoculars. "They're retreating." Otto smiled. "Another one for the tally?" Reinhardt didn't answer. His instincts said otherwise. He'd seen the precision in that return fire, the quick recovery. This was no ordinary tank commander. "No," he said finally. "This one will come back." And he was right. A few hundred meters away, Miller's tank stopped behind a low ridge. He wiped the soot from his face and looked through his field glasses toward the Tiger's last known position. "He's good," he muttered. "But he's not invincible." "Sir," Eddie said quietly, "you want to take on a Tiger? We're outmatched. He hits, we die." "Maybe," Miller replied, eyes narrowing. "But we've got something he doesn't." "What's that?" "Mobility," he said. "And patience." Snow fell thicker now. The forest went silent again, 2 hunters waiting, listening, breathing the same frozen air. Between them stretched less than a mile of woods, but it might as well have been the edge of the world. Neither man knew it yet, but the next 30 minutes would define both their lives. A duel fought not for glory, not for orders, but for mastery. The forest had turned into a frozen maze, white corridors of silence where death could hide behind any branch. Both tanks were now invisible, swallowed by the snow and trees. Yet, somewhere within that lifeless stillness, 2 men were thinking the same thought. Find him before he finds you. Jack Miller's Sherman sat motionless behind a snow-covered ridge. The engine was off. Even the radio operator held his breath. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the occasional hiss of snow sliding from the branches above. The men inside the steel shell felt the cold creeping into their bones, but no one dared move. Every second mattered. Miller crouched by the periscope, his gloved fingers tracing the terrain on a map spread over the turret. He was calculating distances, sightlines, probabilities. "He's got range and armor," he murmured quietly. "But he's big. Slow. Needs room to swing that 88. We make him move into the trees, he's done." The loader, Harris, still nursing his bandaged arm, leaned forward. "Sir, that Tiger's gun could punch through 6 Shermans in a row." "I know," Miller said, his voice steady. "That's why we won't fight him head on. We'll make him think we're running, and then we hit him from the side." Eddie, the driver, frowned. "You mean bait him?" Miller nodded. "Exactly. He's a hunter. He'll come after us. But even a hunter has blind spots. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the gamble. He had only 3 armor-piercing shells left. 3 chances to kill a tiger. Meanwhile, in the other corner of the forest, Colonel Karl Reinhardt sat calmly inside his tiger, listening. The snow muffled everything, but occasionally, faint sounds carried through the stillness. A distant clank, a bird startled from a branch. The signs of life. Reinhardt's instincts were honed from years of battle. Africa, Kursk, Normandy. He knew when an enemy was beaten and when he was waiting. And something about the Americans' last maneuver didn't feel like retreat. He turned to Otto, the gunner. He's not gone. Otto frowned. Sir, he's maneuvering. The shot we landed should have crippled him, but he didn't panic. That tells me he's experienced. He pointed at the forest ahead. He'll try to flank us. Left side, through the birch trees. Move forward 50 meters and pivot right. We'll be ready. The tiger's engine rumbled to life, its deep growl vibrating through the snow. Slowly, methodically, the massive tank began to crawl forward, breaking frozen branches beneath its treads. Inside, the crew moved with clockwork precision. They trusted Reinhardt completely. His calm under fire was legendary. Some whispered he could smell an ambush before it happened. A kilometer away, the Sherman's crew heard it. That low, thunderous vibration that only a tiger could make. He's moving, Miller whispered. Good. Let him. Eddie nodded nervously, hands on the controls. You really think this'll work? Miller gave a thin smile. If it doesn't, we'll never know. He climbed up to the commander's hatch and peered out through the snowfall. The tiger's silhouette flickered between the trees, massive, menacing, almost ghostly in the white haze. Miller's heart pounded. He could feel it, the cold logic of battle, the rhythm of timing and patience. Now, he said quietly. The Sherman's engine roared back to life. It lurched forward, breaking cover and charging down the narrow trail. The move was reckless, or so it seemed. The tiger's periscope swung instantly toward the motion. Contact, Otto shouted. Enemy 1 o'clock. Fire, Reinhardt commanded. The tiger's 88 millimeters thundered, tearing through the air. The shell exploded just behind the Sherman, kicking up a blizzard of dirt and snow. Miller didn't flinch. He wanted the tiger to see him, to follow. Keep moving, he ordered. Don't stop. The Sherman sped down the slope, snow spraying from its treads. Behind them, the tiger emerged from the trees like a monster from the deep, its gun tracking them relentlessly. Loader, AP shell. Otto barked. Loaded. Fire. The second shot screamed past the Sherman, missing by inches. The heat of the blast shook the American tank like a fist. Sir, he's right behind us. Eddie yelled. Good, Miller shouted. That's exactly where I want him. Reinhardt's eyes were locked on the fleeing Sherman. It was fast, surprisingly fast, weaving between trees, kicking up snow. He could sense the desperation of prey, but something didn't add up. Why wasn't the American diving for thicker cover? Why the open ground? His intuition flared. He's luring me. But before he could give the order to halt, the tiger's treads hit a patch of frozen mud beneath the snow. The enormous weight broke through the surface, and suddenly, the front end dipped. Stop! Stop! He barked. The tiger groaned, half sliding into a shallow ditch. The left tread ground helplessly, spinning against ice. Verdammt! Otto swore. We're stuck. Reinhardt cursed under his breath. He knew immediately what had happened. He'd been led into a soft patch near the frozen stream bed. The perfect trap. And then, through the falling snow, he saw it. The Sherman emerging from the tree line on his right flank, gun trained directly on his exposed side. Miller's voice was low, almost calm. Target acquired. Distance, 300 meters. Angle, 45 degrees. Lewis, the gunner, exhaled slowly, finger on the trigger. Ready when you are, boss. Miller's eyes narrowed. Fire. The Sherman's cannon roared. The shell hit the tiger squarely in the side armor. Sparks and flame burst from the impact. The tiger shuddered violently. Inside, Reinhardt's crew was thrown against the walls. The lights flickered. Smoke filled the cabin. Damage to left track and fuel line, the mechanic shouted. Return fire. Reinhardt commanded. Otto spun the turret, but the jammed left tread had locked the rotation. Turret stuck, he shouted. Miller fired again. The second round struck the turret ring, shattering metal. The tiger's armor held, but barely. Reinhardt knew he had seconds, maybe less. "Bail out," he ordered. The hatch flew open, black smoke billowing out as the German crew scrambled into the snow. The last man out was Reinhardt himself, his face smeared with soot, his breath steaming in the frozen air. He turned once to look at the burning Tiger, his Tiger, the machine that had carried him through every front, every victory. It was dying now, flames licking at its armor, hissing against the snow. From the ridge, Miller watched in silence. He didn't fire again. The duel was over. He'd won, not by brute strength, but by cunning. As Reinhardt walked away from the wreckage, their eyes met across the white expanse. No words were spoken, none were needed. It was a look between equals, two warriors who had faced each other not as enemies, but as reflections of the same brutal art. The snow fell heavier, muffling the sound of fire and machinery. The Tiger's turret collapsed inward with a metallic groan, and the forest swallowed the echoes. The duel was over, but the legend had just begun. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Snow continued to drift lazily down over the forest, blanketing the wreckage of war. The burning Tiger hissed and crackled, its flames shrinking as the cold devoured them. The once proud symbol of German engineering now lay crippled and blackened, a grave marker for ambition and defeat. Captain Jack Miller stood beside his Sherman, the metal still warm from firing. He removed his helmet slowly, the frost clinging to his hair and lashes. Around him, his crew climbed out one by one, shivering, coughing, alive. That last word echoed in his head, alive. Against all odds, they had survived a duel that should have killed them a dozen times over. Eddie, his driver, was the first to break the silence. "Sir, we got him." Miller's eyes stayed on the distant Tiger. "Yeah," he said softly. "We got him." But there was no triumph in his voice, only exhaustion, and something heavier. It wasn't joy, not even relief. It was the quiet understanding of what it had cost. The other crew, the men who had fought just as hard, who had done their duty just as well, they were out there too, somewhere in that smoke. And Miller couldn't help but think that if things had gone differently by just a few seconds, they'd be the ones walking away. He took a few steps forward, toward the wreck. The snow was deep, crunching under his boots, the air thick with the smell of burned oil and cordite. When he reached the Tiger, he stopped. The hatch hung open, a trail of black footprints leading away into the trees. No bodies, no gunfire. The German crew had escaped. "Let them go," Miller murmured when Harris raised his rifle. "They've done their fighting." Harris hesitated, then lowered his weapon. No one argued. Half a kilometer away, Colonel Karl Reinhardt and his surviving crew trudged through the forest, their breaths coming in ragged bursts. Smoke clung to their uniforms. None of them spoke. They didn't have to. Every man knew the weight of what had just happened. The Tiger, their invincible beast, was gone. Reinhardt was the last in line, his face pale under the soot. He carried no weapon now, only the memory of the battle. His mind replayed every moment. The shot, the trap, the clever way the American had turned weakness into strength. It was admirable. Painful, but admirable. They stopped at a frozen stream, the world around them a cold gray blur. Otto, the gunner, finally spoke. "Herr Oberst, we failed you." Reinhardt shook his head. "No, you fought like lions. We met a worthy opponent today. There is no shame in that." He gazed toward the smoke rising above the treetops, the death of a machine, but also a moment of truth. "He was good," he said quietly. Whoever he was, that man knew what he was doing. By nightfall, the forest was silent again. Miller and his crew bivouacked beside their Sherman, using the tank's heat to stay alive in the freezing cold. The stars above were distant and indifferent. Harris passed around a tin of coffee, his hands trembling from more than just cold. "You think they made it out?" "Probably," Miller said. "And if they did, I hope they keep running. War's almost over anyway." Eddie looked up. "Would you have taken him prisoner, sir?" "That Tiger commander." Miller thought for a moment. "If he'd let me." He sipped his coffee, staring into the darkness. He couldn't shake the image of the German officer climbing from the burning tank, the brief moment when their eyes had met. There had been no hate in that look, only understanding. A strange kinship born in fire and death. "Funny thing," Miller said after a while. "You spend years training to kill the enemy. Then one day, you finally meet one who feels more like you than anyone else in the world." The others didn't reply. They just sat there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft moan of wind across the snow. Spring came months later, melting away the ice and the scars of the battlefield. The war ended soon after. The Sherman was shipped home, its hull dented and scorched but intact. Miller's crew went their separate ways, some back to farms, others to factories, all trying to forget what they'd seen. But some memories refused to fade. For Miller, it was the Tiger, the duel that haunted his dreams. Sometimes he'd wake up in a sweat, seeing that flash of fire, hearing the groan of metal. Other nights, he'd see the German officer's face, calm and defiant, disappearing into the snow. Years passed. The world changed. New wars came, and the old ones were studied in classrooms and documentaries. But for Miller, the war was not history. It was a frozen forest, a burning tiger, and a ghost he couldn't name. In 1962, 17 years after the war, an international veterans conference was held in London. Soldiers, pilots, and officers from both sides gathered to speak, to remember, to make peace with ghosts. Jack Miller, now gray-haired and retired, attended as a guest speaker. During a reception, he wandered into a small exhibition hall filled with relics, helmets, uniforms, rusted weapons. And there, standing quietly before a display of armored warfare, was a man with a familiar bearing. Tall, composed, his hands clasped behind his back. His uniform was gone, replaced by a civilian suit, but the eyes, sharp, cold, intelligent, had not changed. Miller's breath caught. The man turned. Recognition flickered instantly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, the German smiled faintly. "You drove the Sherman," he said, his accent still heavy. Miller nodded slowly. "And you were in the Tiger." Reinhardt extended his hand. Karl Reinhardt. Jack Miller. They shook hands, not as enemies, but as soldiers. Reinhardt gestured to the display of tanks. "They call that battle the Duel of the Ardennes now. I suppose history enjoys giving names to things we barely survive." Miller chuckled softly. "Yeah, they make it sound cleaner than it was." The two men stood in silence for a long while, staring at the relics of their shared past. Finally, Reinhardt spoke. "I never hated the men I fought. Only the necessity of fighting them." Miller nodded. "Same here. I guess we were both just doing what we had to." When they parted, it was with a quiet nod of mutual respect. Two warriors who had once tried to destroy each other, now bound forever by the memory of one frozen battlefield. Time has a way of turning truth into legend. What began as a brutal, fleeting moment of survival between two tank crews in the Ardennes became a story retold in barracks, books, and documentaries for decades after the war. Soldiers whispered about the duel in the snow, where an American Sherman outwitted a German Tiger against impossible odds. To some, it was a symbol of ingenuity triumphing over brute strength. To others, it was proof that even in the machinery of war, it was the men inside who made the difference. For Captain Jack Miller and Colonel Karl Reinhardt, it was something far simpler, a memory that refused to fade. In post-war America, Miller returned to Illinois. He bought a small house outside Chicago, started a family, and took a job at a steel factory. To his co-workers, he was quiet and steady, a man who never talked much about the war. Only a small dented compass on his desk, a gift from his gunner, Harris, hinted at the soldier he once was. But every winter, when the snow fell heavy and the nights grew silent, he found himself back in that forest, back in that Sherman, back facing the black silhouette of a tiger. Across the ocean, Karl Reinhardt lived in a very different world. The war had stripped him of rank, pride, and homeland, but not purpose. He settled in Munich and taught engineering, helping rebuild a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. His students admired his precision, his calmness, his insistence that a machine's worth depends entirely on the man who commands it. They didn't know how literally he meant those words. Every so often, history found them both again. A journalist tracked down Miller for an interview in 1958, asking him about the famous Ardennes duel. Miller laughed softly and said, "I just did my job. The other guy did his too." When asked how he beat a Tiger tank, he paused, then replied, "I didn't beat him. I outlasted him." That humility made his story even more legendary. Reinhardt, meanwhile, gave a rare lecture at a military academy in 1960. When a cadet asked what it felt like to command a Tiger, he answered, like holding the hand of a god who might crush you at any moment. Then he added, and remember this, no matter how strong your armor is, someone out there is learning how to pierce it. Neither man ever sought fame, but others built it for them. Books exaggerated the duel, claiming it was a showdown between the finest tank aces of East and West. Paintings depicted the snowstorm in romantic brushstrokes, with shells frozen mid-flight. Even Hollywood toyed with the story in the late 1960s, though the studio changed names, faces, and endings. Yet, behind the dramatization, the truth remained. The respect between two men who had tried to kill each other and ended up forever connected by it. In 1975, Miller received a letter from Germany. The handwriting was elegant, the tone formal but warm. It was from Karl Reinhardt. He had read an article about American veterans and had decided to write. The letter read, "Time has softened the memories, but I still remember your eyes through the periscope. Not hatred, just determination. I respected that. I hope life has treated you with peace." Miller kept the letter for years, folded neatly in a metal box along with his dog tags and a faded photo of his crew. He never wrote back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say that could ever equal those words. The duel entered military studies. Analysts examined every tactical choice, using it as a case study in asymmetrical combat, how a lighter, weaker tank could win through maneuver, patience, and intelligence. The U.S. Army even referenced it in officer training manuals for decades, under the lesson, "Superiority of will can overcome superiority of weapon." Yet, beneath the diagrams and lectures, few understood what it truly meant. The battle wasn't about tanks, it was about humanity under pressure. Two men, each believing in his duty, testing the limits of courage, fear, and respect. In 1983, on a cold December morning, Jack Miller passed away in his sleep. He was buried with full military honors, a small Sherman model placed beside his flag-draped coffin. Among the few in attendance was a gray-haired visitor who stood silently at a distance, hat in hand. No one recognized him. When the ceremony ended, the man approached the grave, placed a single white rose on the snow, and whispered, "Rest well, Captain." Then he turned and disappeared before anyone could ask his name. It was Karl Reinhardt's last recorded journey outside Germany. He died 3 years later, in 1986. Among his papers was a single photograph, a grainy image of a Sherman tank half buried in snow, taken by a war correspondent in 1945. On the back, he had written in careful German script, "Er dem Feind, der Kampf dem It Hers." Honor to the enemy who fought with heart. The story of the duel has since outlived them both. It is told in museums, studied in documentaries, and whispered among historians who still argue where exactly it happened. Some say it was near Bastogne, others claim it was south of Malmedy. No one can prove it for certain, but perhaps that's fitting, because some truths in war are not found in maps or archives. They live in the spaces between enemies who learn to see each other as men. The duel between Captain Jack Miller's Sherman and Colonel Karl Reinhardt's Tiger wasn't just another brief, forgotten skirmish in the endless brutality of World War II. It became a metaphor for the evolution of warfare itself. In that frozen forest of the Ardennes, two opposing philosophies clashed head-on: brute force versus adaptability, engineering perfection versus human intuition. And in the years that followed, that encounter, real or mythologized, reshaped how soldiers and strategists understood the nature of battle. After the war, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union raced to study every lesson the conflict had offered. Analysts combed through reports from the Battle of the Bulge, searching for clues about why certain tank units had survived against impossible odds. The story of Miller's outnumbered Sherman, supposedly facing Reinhardt's Tiger and winning, was passed quietly between training officers. It became a whispered doctrine. You don't need to outgun the enemy, outthink him. That idea became central to post-war tank design philosophy. American engineers, reviewing battlefield data, realized that sheer armor thickness and massive guns, like those on the German Tigers and Panthers, came with enormous logistical costs: fuel, transport, repairs, production time. The Sherman had been lighter, faster, easier to repair, and most importantly, more numerous. In that simplicity lay strategic power. In 1947, as Cold War tensions began to rise, the U.S. Army published a restricted document titled Lessons from European Armored Engagements. Though the names were redacted, historians later connected several passages directly to the Miller-Reinhardt encounter. One line stood out: "The superior weapon does not guarantee victory, the superior mind does." That became the foundation for American armored doctrine throughout the Cold War, favoring flexibility, mobility, and crew coordination over raw mechanical dominance. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, a quiet transformation was happening. Many Wehrmacht veterans, like Reinhardt, contributed to the formation of the Bundeswehr, the new West German army. Reinhardt's teachings at the Munich Military Technical Academy heavily influenced a generation of officers who sought to balance the harsh lessons of the past with a more pragmatic view of future conflict. He famously said to his cadets, "The Tiger was magnificent, but she taught us arrogance. Never build a weapon you think is unbeatable. The moment you do, you've already lost." These words spread across NATO training circles. By the late 1950s, American and German cooperation under the NATO umbrella meant joint exercises and shared tactical philosophy, ironically merging the lessons of both men's wartime experiences. But the influence didn't stop at military academies. The public fascination with tank warfare exploded in the 1960s and 70s. War correspondents, novelists, and filmmakers romanticized duels between tank aces, the mechanical gladiators of the 20th century. Some based their stories directly on the Miller-Reinhardt myth. The BBC aired a 1971 documentary titled Steel and Snow, The Duel in the Ardennes, featuring interviews with veterans who claimed to have witnessed it. The footage, grainy, cold, haunting, captured burned-out tanks half buried in white silence. It rekindled the sense that this was not just history, it was legend. In the U.S., model kits of the Ardennes duel were sold in hobby stores, depicting a Sherman and Tiger locked in eternal opposition. Children played out miniature versions of that battle, never realizing it symbolized something far deeper: the struggle between overwhelming odds and human will. Academics began to dissect the psychological undertones of such duels. A 1982 paper from the University of Cambridge titled The Duel as Myth in Modern Warfare argued that Miller and Reinhardt represented the archetypal opposites of industrial conflict: mass production versus individual mastery, democracy versus dictatorship, intuition versus precision. Their duel, real or not, became a cultural mirror of how societies viewed themselves after the war. The moral lessons echoed just as loudly. Miller's crew had fought not because they were confident, but because they refused to surrender. Reinhardt's men had fought not out of hatred, but duty. And somewhere within that paradox lay the haunting truth of all wars: how men could destroy one another with respect in their hearts. Even modern military thinkers reference the duel when teaching decision-making under fire. A 2010 NATO leadership seminar cited it as a perfect example of composure in chaos. The lecturer ended with this note: "Both men survived the battle, but each carried the other's ghost for the rest of their life." Victory isn't always measured in who lived or died. It's in who learned. By the dawn of the 21st century, new generations of historians began digging for records, after-action reports, vehicle logs, crew lists, trying to confirm whether Miller and Reinhardt were real men or symbolic composites drawn from many encounters. Some claim to have found Miller's service record in the 3rd Armored Division archives, listing a Captain J. Miller, who fought near Bastogne in late December 1944. Others believe the story merged multiple engagements into one mythic narrative. But in truth, that distinction doesn't matter anymore. Because whether it was a single duel or a collection of similar ones, its meaning transcended history. It reminded future warriors and civilians alike that technology is only as powerful as the soul guiding it. That even amidst the horror of war, humanity persists. In the fleeting moment when one enemy looks through his gun sight and sees not a target, but a reflection. The snow had long melted from the forests of the Ardennes, but for those who survived that day, the day when fire met ice and 2 tank commanders faced destiny, the battle never truly ended. Wars leave behind scars that metals can't heal, and no victory, however righteous, comes without a toll. For Captain Jack Miller, the memory of that duel lingered like the hum of distant artillery that never quite fades. When the war ended in May 1945, he returned to the United States with a chest full of commendations but a heart heavy with ghosts. On paper, he was a hero, commended for extraordinary leadership under enemy fire. Yet every night he woke to the sound of grinding treads and the echo of his crew's last screams in the turret. He tried to find solace in peace, settling in a quiet New England town, working as a mechanic, repairing the very machines that had once saved and destroyed lives alike. Yet, the sound of an engine backfiring would send him spiraling into memories of that frozen field. The faces of his crew, Corporal Davis, Private Henley, and Sergeant O'Brien, visited him often, not in dreams, but in the moments of silence when the world grew too still. He could still hear Davis shouting coordinates, Henley's nervous laugh over the intercom, O'Brien's prayer before the final shot that ended the duel. Jack never spoke of the German commander, but those who knew him said there was a strange respect in his eyes when he talked about the war. A quiet reverence, not for the cause, but for the courage of men who fought it. Far across the ocean, in the ruins of a divided Germany, Colonel Karl Reinhardt was a man rebuilding from ashes, both his nation's and his own. Captured in early 1945, he spent 2 years as a POW in a U.S. camp in France. His interrogators described him as calm, articulate, unbroken, but there was a shadow in his words. When asked what he thought of the Americans, he replied softly, "They fight differently, not with hatred, but with necessity." I envied that. After his release, he returned to what was left of Munich, where his home had been reduced to rubble and his wife, Anna, was gone, lost in the bombings of 1944. His son, Lucas, had survived, a boy of 9 with eyes too old for his age. Reinhardt became a teacher, instructing post-war German officers in tactics, not to glorify war, but to prevent its repetition. His lectures were precise, calm, but when he spoke of tank warfare, his voice sometimes faltered. In one such lecture, he told his students, "I once faced an enemy I did not hate. We fought each other as men, not monsters. That was the day I understood. War is not about nations, it's about choices." Many years later, that quote would be etched on a plaque at the Bundeswehr Panzer Museum. In the 1950s, fate drew a quiet circle around both men once more. During a NATO conference in Brussels, a list of attendees included Ret. Captain John Miller, U.S. Army liaison, and Colonel Karl Reinhardt, Federal Republic of Germany. Neither man expected the other to be there. The records don't say whether they met, but a photograph exists. It shows 2 men standing side by side, shaking hands at a reception hall, a faint smile between them. Their eyes say everything: relief, respect, understanding. Some historians debate whether it was truly them, but those who believe point out a small detail: the patch on Miller's jacket, the 3rd Armored Division, and the Iron Cross on Reinhardt's lapel. The caption beneath simply reads, "From Enemies to Soldiers of Peace, 1954. The emotional aftermath of that duel rippled through generations. Miller's son, David, joined the U.S. Army in the 1960s, not out of patriotism, but to understand his father's silence. During his service in Vietnam, he carried a photograph of a Sherman tank, burned and half buried in snow. On the back, his father had written, "Courage isn't killing. It's standing when you're scared to death." Reinhardt's grandson, Lucas Jr., became a historian, dedicating his career to researching Allied and German encounters of the Ardennes campaign. His most famous paper, Two Tanks, One Truth, argued that the duel symbolized the last human battle before the machines took over the soul of war. By the 1980s, both Miller and Reinhardt had passed away. Miller in 1981, quietly in his sleep, and Reinhardt in 1983, during a snowstorm in Bavaria. Their families received letters of condolence from veterans associations and military historians. In one of Miller's belongings, his daughter found a note he'd written but never sent. It read, "To the German I fought that winter day, you were the best I ever faced. I hope you made it home. We were soldiers once, and that was enough." No one knows if he ever tried to send it. But when historians found that letter decades later, they sent a copy to the Panzer Museum in Germany. It was displayed beside Reinhardt's teaching notes on armored tactics. 2 artifacts from opposite sides of war, reunited, just as their authors had been. The duel had begun as a contest of skill and survival. But in the end, It became something far greater, a testament to the strange brotherhood of those who fight. Across the centuries, every soldier learns the same truth. Courage doesn't belong to one side of the battlefield. In the smoke and snow of that frozen Ardennes morning, amidst the roar of steel and the silence that followed, two men, born enemies, had met as equals. And when the fire died and the guns went silent, what remained was not hatred. It was understanding. History has a way of bending truth into myth. Sometimes, the stories we tell about war outlive the facts that birthed them. The duel between the American tanker and the German Panzer Ace became one such legend, a tale retold in mess halls, memoirs, and eventually, documentaries that blurred the line between memory and mythology. It began quietly. In 1947, the Stars and Stripes published a short article titled, "One Tank, One Battle, One Man." It told the story of a lone Sherman tank that stood its ground against a superior German Panther during the Battle of the Bulge. The piece didn't name either commander but hinted at a remarkable duel near the Ardennes village of Bergheim. Veterans who had been there recognized fragments of truth. Others filled in the blanks with their own memories until the tale became folklore. By the 1950s, military historians began to trace the incident. The U.S. National Archives listed after-action reports matching the description, a skirmish between elements of the 3rd Armored Division and remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment. Among those reports, one stood out, a citation for Captain John Miller, recommending him for the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation mentioned sustained engagement with an enemy tank under heavy fire resulting in its destruction and preservation of his platoon's flank. Across the Atlantic, a similar record surfaced in captured German documents. Oberst Karl Reinhardt, cited for exceptional leadership during defensive actions near Bergheim. Though the documents never explicitly mentioned a duel, the coordinates matched. Slowly, historians began to piece together the puzzle, confirming that these two officers, once separated by nations, had indeed met in battle. By the 1960s, the story found new life in popular culture. A best-selling novel titled Steel Against Steel fictionalized the event, depicting the duel as a moral clash between two men burdened by honor and duty. Hollywood soon followed. The 1967 film adaptation, The Winter Duel, turned it into a spectacle of fire and fury, featuring grand tank battles, sweeping orchestral scores, and the classic American hero archetype. But what the audience didn't see were the quieter truths, the fear, the doubt, the shared humanity that connected both men. In one scene, the film's American commander shouts, "For freedom," before charging forward. The real Captain Miller, in his journal, had written something far simpler, "For them, my men." That's all. Reinhardt's son, Lucas, who watched the movie years later, described it bitterly in his diary. "They turned my father into a villain because history prefers heroes in black and white. But he was just a man trying to bring his crew home." Still, the legend persisted. By the 1980s, military academies in both the US and Germany used the duel as a case study in tank tactics and psychological warfare. Analysts dissected every reported maneuver, how the Sherman used terrain advantage, how the Panther adjusted its firing angle, and how both commanders demonstrated an uncanny ability to read each other's intentions. What fascinated scholars most wasn't the technology or firepower, it was the instinct. How two humans, trained to destroy, ended up mirroring each other's moves like reflections in a darkened mirror. One researcher wrote, "It was less a battle of tanks and more a duel of minds, a tragic ballet of steel and will." In time, this framing gave birth to a deeper cultural fascination, the idea that war, for all its chaos, could reveal the noblest parts of human nature. The duel became a symbol not of violence, but of discipline, respect, and restraint. Then, in 1995, a discovery reignited global interest. A British documentary team excavating wartime wrecks in Belgium found the rusted hull of a Panther tank near the coordinates of the Bergheim battlefield. Inside the commander's cupola lay a corroded Luger pistol, a monocle, and a nameplate etched with K. Reinhardt. The story made headlines. The Times called it the tank that time forgot. Within weeks, international media descended upon the site. The Smithsonian covered it. German TV aired a feature titled Requiem for the Iron Beast. Historians confirmed that the location matched the after-action reports from both armies. The following year, an American veterans group arranged a small memorial at the site, a granite plaque engraved in English and German, in memory of those who fought here. Enemies in war, brothers in courage. Among those who attended were descendants of both men. David Miller stood beside Lucas Reinhardt Jr. Their grandfather's legacies joined at last in peace. When asked what the duel meant to him, David replied, "It wasn't about who won. It was about what they both gave up." Lucas nodded, his voice quiet. And what they both understood, that courage and tragedy are sometimes the same thing. By the 2000s, the story had entered the digital age. YouTube videos, documentaries, podcasts, and even online war simulators began referencing the duel at Bergheim. Internet forums debated who had fired first, which tank had the superior advantage, and whether the entire encounter was over in minutes or hours. But the deeper message endured. Viewers across generations were drawn not just to the mechanics of war, but to the emotion within it, the shared humanity between men on opposite sides of history. A 2012 documentary, Echoes of Steel, closed with a haunting line over archival footage of snow falling on abandoned tanks. History remembers battles by their victors. But sometimes, the truest victory is understanding. That understanding became the heart of the legend. What began as a frozen firefight in 1945 had evolved into a timeless meditation on courage, compassion, and the contradictions of war. The duel of Captain Miller and Colonel Reinhardt, real or half-remembered, factual or mythologized, transcended history. It became a story not just about two men, but about all who stand in the path of chaos and choose duty over hatred. And in the end, that is what every legend seeks to teach us. That even in humanity's darkest hours, light can emerge from the smoke and snow. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world tried to move on. Cities rebuilt, nations healed, and people buried their dead. But some stories refused to stay buried. Stories like that of the duel between the American tanker and the German Panzer Ace. It wasn't just another battlefield encounter. It was a mirror reflecting everything that war reveals about the human spirit, its fury, its fear, and its fleeting flashes of honor. In the decades that followed, both sides of the Atlantic continued to unearth fragments of their story. A piece of torn map here, a burned-out shell casing there, the faded pages of a soldier's journal. Each discovery felt like another piece of a jigsaw puzzle that humanity kept trying to complete, not to glorify war, but to understand it. Military historians called it the most human duel of the mechanical age. For them, it represented the transition from old-world heroism to modern warfare, a moment when courage no longer belonged to knights on horseback, but to men inside machines of steel. It was a moment where technology magnified both bravery and tragedy. In the quiet corners of libraries and war museums, their story endured not because of who won, but because of what it meant. Captain John Miller, the son of an Ohio farmer who became an armored division officer, embodied the quiet American ideal, strength with restraint. Colonel Karl Reinhardt, the aristocratic tactician of the German Panzer Corps, represented the other side of that same coin. Discipline without cruelty, pride without blind obedience. The two never met in peace. Yet, through that brief, violent encounter, they understood something few soldiers ever could, that respect can survive even on a battlefield. Years later, letters discovered in Miller's family attic revealed a haunting passage he wrote after the war. "I sometimes wonder if the man I faced in that valley survived. If he did, I hope he went home. We both did what we had to do. And maybe, someday, someone will tell the story not as victory or defeat, but as two men caught in history's machinery." Reinhardt, meanwhile, left behind a journal of his own. Found decades later in a farmhouse near Munich, its final entry read, "We were trained to see them as the enemy. But in that moment, under the snow, I saw only another man who refused to yield. And I respected him. Two men, divided by flags, united by understanding." As time passed, their duel became more than a story of war. It became a parable of humanity. Military cadets studied it as a lesson in tactical decision-making. Psychologists analyzed it as an example of battlefield empathy, the capacity to recognize one's enemy as equally human, even amid destruction. Filmmakers revisited it again and again, each generation reinterpreting the legend through its own lens. Some portrayed it as a tragedy, others as a symbol of moral victory. But the heart of it remained unchanged. War is fought with machines, but decided by men. The 2010 documentary Iron Hearts ended with a simple, lingering shot: two restored tanks, one Sherman, one Panther, standing silent side by side in a snow-covered museum courtyard. No dialogue, no narration, just the sound of wind and distant echoes of artillery fading into nothing. The symbolism was clear. The duel was over. Time had won.